Look, my basic hypothesis is that we're in a demographic winter and there's a downward spiral we're never going to get out of. But the popular narrative is that population is the problem and population needs to be at a sustainable level and people are enemies of the environment. So I think we've reached a stage where we're free-falling, and Scotland will never break out of this, and Western Europe will not break out of this downward spiral. I'm not a demographer, and the census isn't until next year. So all the census data is 10 years out of date, and so a lot of this field of science is, and I'm hoping there are some demographers in the audience, is about speculation. But to warm you up, and you've been working in your groups, I've got 5 quick questions. And Richard hates this sort of academic examination because it's multiple choice, and that means you needn't have studied a thing all year, and you can have a guess at this. So just individually, as we warm up, my first question is, which 18th century economist first postulated that population growth is exponential and food production increases arithmetically, inevitably resulting in famine and war? So on a piece of paper, just jot down, was it A, David Ricardo, B, Adam Smith, C, Thomas Malthus, D, David Hume? Just jot that down, and we'll see how many you get right at the end. Second question, who in 1995 coined the phrase, the culture of death? Was it A, Timothy McVeigh, B, Pope John Paul II, C, Albert Gore, or D, Quentin Tarantino? So in the trade, this is just called a warm-up exercise, okay? What does TFR stand for? A, trans fertility rate. B, total fertility rate. C, temporary fertility reduction. D, transitional fertility ratio. And you need to get that one right before you move on to the next question, because the next question is, which of the following countries has the lowest TFR? Is it Italy, Scotland, England and Wales, or Germany? And then finally, question 5, and this means whether you get your higher grade or whatever in demography. How much has Scotland's population grown between 1950 and 2020? Was it between 1% and 5%? 6% and 10%? 11% and 20%? Between 21% and 30%? So I'm expecting some pretty good marks from you guys, but I'm not going to embarrass you just yet. We'll leave it towards the end of the presentation. But we're living in fear of population growth. And I did want to talk about the 1950s. I was born in the 1950s, and there was a thing called Life with Lucy. Anybody? I heard some yeses there. There's a few. And in a way, Life with Lucy or I Love Lucy, I think there were about 7 series, started in about 1952. This was required viewing, and it was very sort of family orientated. There was a family around a sitting room sofa. Lucy didn't work. She sometimes went out part-time to work at a bank, and she would destroy the banking system. So she was best left at home. Her husband, Desi Arnaz, would come back home about 5 o'clock, and there was always a commotion going on in the house. There were children running around. The neighbors would pop in. Vivian was the next door neighbor. She was a lovely character. But this captured the zeitgeist of the 1950s. This family show, very, very clean. And Lucy, although she was quite a modern woman because she wore sort of pedal pants, and we thought that was odd as children watching this, and had a big shock of beautiful ginger hair, and it was about the relationship with the husband, and sorry? Some heckling, excellent. It wouldn't be a party political conference without that. So I'm using this as a symbol of what it was like in the 50s, but at the same time, there was a Cold War going on, and that's a Vulcan bomber, and like the vice chairman, I've got a sort of forces background, and my father he was charged with loading these bombers with nuclear weapons. And I can remember the squadrons of bombers revving up at the end of the runway, went on a red full alert to drop their bombs on a Russian city. And we lived in terror of this, and you could hear the noise of these reverse thrusts, and a Vulcan bomber makes a whining, screaming noise, and we'd lie in bed awake, because we're living quite near the runway, in fear of this. And yet, I Love Lucy would come along, and everything would be sort of settled. So we had real fears, and I often compare this fear that we had of the Cold War against Russia. And I remember my father saying that when they bomb the Russian city, they'll be coming over here to destroy us. I suggest you drive to Scotland. Now, this worried me because, one, my mother couldn't drive. And so after that, I paid very close attention to how my father double declutched on a hill. But he had this MG Magnet, which he was very, very proud of. And I thought, blimey, what's worse, getting bombed or damaging this car? So in my mind, I was learning as the eldest son to drive this up to Scotland. Thank goodness Nicola's not here, because she would have blocked the frontier. So we had this fear, but once the Cold War finished, and by the way, the strategy was called mutually assured destruction, MAD. That once we bombed the Russian cities, at the same time they would launch their attack on us, and that seemed to keep things stable, but it terrified us as children. But as soon as the Cold War bomb had left us, a new terror tactic emerged, and it was called the population bomb, that babies are destructive, that babies are destroying the planet, and just as we were beginning to settle down and enjoying Lucille Ball, this comes up. So that was a big, big book, totally sort of disproven. And they posited this view of a population, a sustainable population level. And they said it's about 2 billion people. And our current population is around 9. The world population is suspected to be around 9 billion. And then immediately after that, there was a very creepy organization called the Club of Rome, and they introduced a book which sold millions, and it's still being reprinted, The Limits to Growth. And once again, it's population that's the problem. And that was published in about 1972. And everyone bought this book, and everyone suddenly turned against people. And there was this reinvention of Malthus, and that's the answer to the first question. The economist is Thomas Malthus. I think he was an Anglican clergyman and an economist, as I am an economist. And he had this basic theory that the development of resources, increasing arithmetically, could not keep up with the growth in population, and inevitably you would have some sort of point of crisis and a famine and the sort of inevitable destruction of the world. So they were recycling these old 18th century ideas about the population. The TFR is the total fertility rate. So give yourself a tick if you define TFR as total fertility rate. This is very, very important. It's really the period, the age grouping when a woman is fertile and able to have children, usually between 16 and 44. The TFR rate in Scotland in 1950, when I was born, was 5. And in 2020, it's 1.37. And the replacement rate, as we know, is 2.1. And so the population of Scotland is ticking over at 2.1, but it's been in serious decline. And it's only the healthy introduction of immigration and the benefits that immigration provides that keeps us at a reasonably sustainable level. But we can't go on pinching other people's skilled labour and skilled workers. And as you know, that Scottish family policy, not to steal, say, health workers that are required in their own country. So we've got a serious problem. And Italy, in that question that I set you, has got the lowest in Europe, which is incredible. Life expectancy in 1950 was 64, and for males, 69 for females, which strikes me as being surprisingly high for Scotland. And it's in 2020, it's 77 for males and 81 for females. So get those legacy leaflets written out. So that's the two sides of the problem. We've got no births, and we're all living longer, and the mix of the population is sort of top-heavy. It should be a pyramid. And all of us baby boomers, myself, have been through the system, this big bulge in the middle of the system, all the post-war hope. We had hope, and we wanted to build families, and everything was around the family. And despite the Cold War, we had hope. And now there seems to be no hope, and there seems almost like a collective death wish, a desire to commit suicide, collective suicide. We don't want to go on anymore as a nation. That's what it's saying collectively. And so it's those two sides, the longer expectancy of life and the lower birth rates are causing this spiral. So there are no more baby bubbles in the system. Our lot was the last one, post-war baby boom. No babies. And no babies means a decline in demand and consumption. No babies leads on to a demographic winter and collective national suicide. And this is replicated across the developed world. And Japan was the first country. And remember, in 1989, Japan was totally in control economically in terms of trade. It started there. And we've had this terrific stagnation in terms of the economy in Japan. And some economic writers call it the economic cliff. I mean, it's pretty obvious. I think at the age of 44, that's when we maximize on our consumption and on our demands for homes, to support our children, to support families, to buy clothes. And that, if we don't have the young people coming into that age grouping, the economy suffers. And we don't have the people to care for the elderly and the infirm. So that's one of the things that happened. And why did it happen? I think children, and it was reflected, I think, in the excellent talk that Belinda gave us, and we really need to unpick on those wonderful defense of marriage and the outcomes of this attack on marriage, that children are now seen as a cost, not as an investment, and I think that's down to its materialism since the 1950s, the economic servitude of families. They're reliant on the two incomes, and they have to delay pregnancy and control pregnancy. The state supplants the family by providing these nurseries. I think they're farms, they're state farms, they're Stalinist in outlook. They teach, the child needs the family situation. And okay, as a short-term measure, but everyone accepts that this is the solution. Mothers want choices, and not everyone wants the state farm to supplant their family. And if they're teaching 4-year-olds about transgender ideology, they could be doing it all in the nurseries. And those images you see on blackboards and around classrooms, that'll be in the nurseries as well. Feminism and the control of the body became paramount, and that the contraception mentality, and that if contraception failed, you had a right to abort that child who you didn't want. And all this has led to an decrease in fertility rates among women and men. Right across Europe, there's been a decline in the fertility of men, the sperm count of men. And by delaying pregnancy, by the effect of some types of contraception, that some contraception is in fact an abortifacient, we've got this decreasing fertility rate. The solution, I love this quote. It's from the philosopher Peter Kreeft. The single most possible thing we can do to save our civilization at all times and all places and in all cultures, whether they are good or evil, religious or irreligious, ancient or modern, is to have children. And we've lost that totally. Children are the enemy. Children are the enemy of environmentalism. People are pollutants. And it's the planet that is king. And you're right, I think this is all merging together. And I remember the Huxley from the Brave New World. They talked about that. The hatchery centre. The hatchery centre is exactly what Richard was talking about in terms of eugenics, where you pick these best characteristics. So that's the solution. And I don't know whether that sustainable population, Scottish Job Creation Scheme. So that's just a beggar going around with no clothing. That's the result of a SNP. Sustainable population program, and they're not waking up to this. They've got no ideas. There is a task group exploring the impact of this demographic winter, but they won't call it a demographic winter. They won't call it an economic cliff. But you cannot break the spiral once it's started. People don't want children, don't like children, and only countries like Hungary are attempting to revert this trend and to encourage families and to encourage having children if the parents want children, and to be more family friendly, and to say there are other models for our society and for our culture. And as Pope Francis said at an opening address earlier this year, if families are not at the centre of the present, there will be no future. Well said. That's the situation we're in. This is disastrous. And we have to be standing up. So, some positive outcomes. What happens next? Get a higher birth rate. I come from the business world. You need consumers. You need people demanding something. It doesn't mean pollution or more packaging or waste. That's the freedom of the individual, is to choose, is to have income and to spend that income on their family or whatever. But that's been the basis of economic growth since the very beginning. That people always equal more innovation and problem solving. The more people you have, problems get solved, we get new technologies, we create new markets. And what a cheat to say to impress on the third world that they're not allowed to have children. And by the way, the same trends can be seen in Africa and India. I think India's total fertility rate's at around 2.3. What we need is a minister for the family. That's what we want. We want family at the centre of policy making. We want more economic choices to parents. Children are our legacy. I mean, that's our future. And we want the Scottish Family Party elected to fight this cause. But the cliff, the winter, is a continued dependence on immigration in the short term, and every country's doing the same. They're fighting for immigration, and we believe that's unfair on the home country, and we're stealing their best nurses, their best doctors. Surely that's unfair. But as you know, we like a healthy level of immigration, and that's good for the economy. We're coming up to this great reset. It's all part of it, and these forces that are replanning the world economy and starting a fresh start. And it's certainly not a start that puts children at the centre, that can make Meghan and Harry win awards for saying they're not going to have any more than 2 children, and they're seen as a model. I think we're going to see an expansion of contraceptive implants in our schools. Abortion and sterilisation also continuing in developing countries. Eugenic screening of new citizens, the point Jacob, that you're not worthy to be a citizen unless you pass all the health checks at birth. And abortion can be undertaken, postnatal abortion, for 6 months after birth. Sustainable population levels at 2 billion, and that's why it's an open door, it's an open goal for assisted suicide and euthanasia to lop off this top-heavy population. So that's the grim future, that's the economic winter, that's the cliff we are descending down.